The business of psychology has boomed in the second half of the 20th century, spawning a panoply of different analytical approaches. But in America, in 1943, one particular version of Freudianism dominated, a version which placed heavy emphasis on childhood experiences.
It seemed like Mom spent most of her time helping Dad with his business. I guess she didn't have much time left over for me, even when I was sick.
For Freud, the personality was constructed in childhood. This, for him, was the crucible where all humans were made. The problem for Lange and his team was that Hitler had been very careful to virtually obliterate his past. They'd very little to go on. What they did know was that Hitler had 3 brothers who all died young, and 2 sisters. They were also aware that his father was a drunken brute who beat the young Adolf regularly. And, for Lange, that would almost certainly have a significant effect on Hitler's psyche.
Under such circumstances, the child becomes confused and is unable to identify himself with a clear-cut pattern that he can use as a guide for his own adjustment. Not only is this a severe handicap in itself, but in addition, the child is given a distorted picture of the world around him and the nature of the people in it.
The void is created in childhood. It represents what we've come to call the wound itself. And in Hitler's case, we really have to go back several generations to be understanding what was so troubling to this man. He described a very sadistic father, Alois, 22 years older than his mother, who was violent with the children, would beat the dog until it urinated, at one point left Hitler for dead after a savage beating.
Lange suspected that Hitler's abusive father would drive him into the arms of his mother, which would have profound psychological consequences. Lange was presented with an opportunity to test this theory when he tracked down the Hitler family doctor in New York. His name was Dr. Eduard Bloch. He was Jewish and had escaped from Austria when the Nazis annexed the country in 1938.
Did Hitler have any medical problems?
Oh, I only treated him for minor colds, of course measles. He was a weak child, but he had no physical deformity and definitely no tuberculosis, although tuberculosis was hereditary in the family from the father's side.
Well, I suppose if that's the case, you can't have known him very well.
On the contrary, I was the Hitler family doctor. I got to know them all very well when I was treating his mother for breast cancer. I gave her an injection every day.
What was Hitler like with his mother?
Well, I have to say that the relationship between a mother and son, their reciprocal adoration was unusual.
How did this manifest itself?
When I summoned Hitler and his 2 sisters, who were married, they didn't live at home, when I summoned them to my office to tell them their mother was gravely ill with no hope of recovery, his reaction to this news was touching. His long, sallow face was contorted, tears flowed from his eyes. The girls, on the other hand, received the news with calm, reserve. Only then did I realize the magnitude of the relationship that existed between mother and son.
When his mother finally died of breast cancer, Dr. Bloch was amazed at Hitler's reaction.
In the practice of my profession, it is, of course, quite natural that I should have witnessed many scenes such as this one. Yet none has left me with quite the same impression. In all my career, I have never seen anyone so prostrate with grief as Adolf Hitler. His mother would turn in her grave if she knew what he turned out to be.
For Hitler, his mother's grave became something of a shrine. There's evidence in one of the many home movies shot by Hitler's lover, Eva Braun. This one shows Hitler, Eva, and some friends on a trip to Leonding, where the Fuhrer grew up, and the site of his mother's grave. Her son covered the tombstone in Nazi icons and memorabilia. Eva took no moving pictures of Hitler at the graveside, but there are a series of telling still images.
Every scrap of evidence indicates there was an extremely strong attachment between Hitler and his mother. This was due in part to the fact that she had lost 2 or possibly 3 children before Adolf was born. And since he too was frail as a child, it's natural that she'd do everything in her power to guard against the recurrence of her earlier tragedy. And the result was that she catered to his whims, even to the point of spoiling him, and that she was overprotective in her attitude toward him.
For Lange's team, Hitler's infatuation with his mother and loathing for his father was a perfect fit for Freud's famous Oedipus complex.
Life with his mother must have been a veritable paradise for Adolf, except for the fact of when his father would intrude and disrupt the happy relationship. As he got older, infantile sexual feelings were probably quite prominent in this relationship. This is the Oedipus complex. The more he hated his father, the more dependent he became upon the affection and love of his mother. And the more he loved his mother, the more afraid he became of his father's vengeance should he be discovered.
Every little boy, as he is desperately wanting the total love of his mother, comes to see his father as a rival. This, however, can be particularly powerful if you have had an overly attentive mother, as Hitler did, and an abusive father, as Hitler did. But with that abusive authority, there is on the one hand the wish to get rid of him, but on the other hand the fear of his power, which is represented in the so-called castration complex.
For a Freudian like Lange, this extreme castration anxiety could manifest itself in adulthood in the fear of syphilis. Freud even had a name for it: syphiliphobia.
Throughout Mein Kampf, he comes back to the topic of syphilis again and again, and spends almost an entire chapter describing its horrors. In almost all cases, we find that a fear of this sort is rooted in a fear of genital injury during childhood.
Lange continued to examine Hitler's childhood through the lens of Freudianism.
We're doing as best we can with what we have.
For the father of psychology, there were 5 clearly delineated stages of growing up. And what Lange was looking for was signs that one of the stages had gone wrong. Because, according to Freud, if they did, there would be profound psychological consequences. Dr. Bloch provided corroborating evidence for this theory.
Hitler and his mother lived in a rented apartment. It was a small place, rather poor. My predominant impression of this simple furnished apartment was its cleanliness. Oh, it glistened. Not a speck of dirt on the chairs or the tables, not a stray fleck of mud on the scrubbed floor, not a smudge on the panes of the windows. Frau Hitler was a superb housekeeper.
Hitler's mother's obsessive cleanliness was significant for Lange.